Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today we're going to talk about blue-red in Neon Dynasty. So, first, a reminder, of course, the notes that I'll be referencing while I talk about this are available on patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So, let's get straight into it. Blue-red is the third lowest win rate archetype in the format according to 17 lands, among the two color pairs, of course, just ahead of white-red and red-green. I've personally had some success with it. I've drafted it 3 times, trophied twice. I don't think it's that bad, but it's also not amazing. Talk through some of what's going on there. Biggest picture, single point of advice, the thing that I think you want to be focusing on while you're drafting this deck is that you want to keep your curve as low as possible. Both the Reconfigure and Ninjutsu are powerful abilities in this archetype, and they're both very mana intensive. So that means you don't want to have spells that are also asking you to spend a lot of mana, because your deck is going to be capable of spending mana anyway, and you're not going to be able to take full advantage of all of your cards if you have expensive cards, plus cards that want you to spend extra mana on them. As an added bonus, if your curve is very low, then Experimental Synthesizer is a really good card, and then that has synergies with Voltage Surge, which is another card that, both of those are low-cost cards themselves and kind of work well in this like low-curve package strategy thing that I think Blue-Red wants to be up to. So if you want just quick hit, single piece of advice to go forth and draft Blue-Red, it's really prioritize keeping your curve as low as possible. When in doubt, take the cheaper card. There are artifact synergies available. Mostly, I think Patchwork Automaton is the most important card to push you in that direction. I don't think you want to work super hard to max your artifact count to push Tuashi Songshaper or whatever. But I think that if you have Patchwork Automaton, then it's worth thinking about trying to maximize your artifacts and or your ninjas. If you're picking up a ninja with an artifact, then that'll let you trigger Patchwork Automaton again. So a little bit of added value there. But I think it's, more important to focus on having a low curve, generally aggressive strategy over going out of your way to play as many artifacts as possible specifically. The Patchwork Automaton, essentially, 2 mana, 1/1, ward 2. Whenever you play an artifact, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So the Mechanaut is the blue-red 2/2 flyer that makes your artifacts cost 1 less. That card is good since it itself is cheap and it helps make your other cards cheaper and you want to play cheap cards. But I don't think that you want to go particularly far out of your way to push its synergies by making sure that you're playing artifacts or looking for expensive artifacts to make cheaper with it or anything. Even if I had that, I would still want to fill my deck with just cards that cost 1, even though they don't get the discount. So yeah, low curve, aggressive. I think Suit Up in particular is very important because you want to be just attacking a lot, and Suit Up makes it very, very easy to just attack with whatever you have. So Suit Up is really good in this archetype, given that, the problem with where Suit Up is bad is if you don't have a creature or if creatures that you have are already big. But if you're playing a lot of creatures that cost 1 and 2 mana, then you'll reliably able to get value out of it when you want to. Your opponent's going to be inclined to block if you're getting some damage through early, and then you can use this to, do what you want, which is kill a creature and draw a card for 3 mana. So Suit Up is a good blue card that really excels in blue-red in particular. I've talked about, aggressive archetypes where creatures can kind of be sorted into having evasion or provoke, something that encourages your opponent to block them or something that makes them harder to block. The more your creatures naturally lend themselves to getting blocked, the better Suit Up is. Blue mostly plays creatures that are trying not to get blocked, although some of the ninjas, like Moon Circuit Hacker, are likely to get blocked. They're cards that your opponent doesn't want to let you hit them with again after they're in play. But the red creatures are generally creatures that your opponent is very inclined to try to block. And so Suit Up pairs particularly well with the red creatures in the format to get your opponent to block and then get to use Suit Up to punish them. Let's talk about some of the best commons in the archetype. First, let's start with the weird one. Not that weird because this card is known to be very good, but Imperial Oath is the second winningest common in blue-red Notable, obviously, that I said you want to keep your curve very low and you want to try to be aggressive, and you would expect that an off-color 6-drop would not be a card that you would want if all of that's true. Yep. Imperial is good though. I do think that the normal red, like philosophically red, blue red decks, I don't think want Imperial Oath, but I think that there's a different way to draft blue red where Imperial Oath is very good, which is like your red cards are the same red cards that I recommend in the red white Imperial Oath deck. Your red cards are Experimental Synthesizer and Kami's Flare and Voltage Surge. And then you have blue cards like the Modern Age and any random, like really just any blue cards. It doesn't matter. Just normal blue cards and then red removal and then hang out and play the Imperial Oaths that you're splashing. And that's like getting into strategically very similar to my recommended plan for red white, where instead of extra white removal, you have extra blue, probably just like card filtering, maybe a little bit of white removal plus Imperial Oath. I'm not going to be focusing on that kind of deck. I think I've really explained like cheap removal plus Imperial Oath as a strategy in the red white episode. So here I'm going to be looking at the kinds of blue red decks that are not playing the second best common in the color pair Imperial Oath. So from among cards that you can cast with blue and red mana, so Moon Circuit Hacker is the only common that performs better than Imperial Oath. It's 1.5% win rate on 17 lands, ahead of the second winningest common in this, like among blue and red commons, Network Disruptor. Moon Circuit Hacker is like notably better than other stuff in blue red in a way that is interesting because it's not that way in other archetypes. Across the board, the Modern Age is the best blue common, but in blue red, Moon Circuit Hacker is. Not terribly difficult to figure out why that is. Moon Circuit Hacker is best when you have 1-mana creatures and, generally cheap creatures and cheap removal so that you can get easy value out of your Moon Circuit Hacker's first card draw and then maybe clear blockers and continue getting value out of it. And if your whole deck has a pretty low curve, it can be easy to profitably like discard lands and draw cards and benefit from its looting ability more than you might in some other archetypes. So Moon Circuit Hacker is a particularly high priority for blue red. Beyond that, the other important commons, Network Disruptor, Kami's Flare, Voltage Surge, Moon Snare Specialist, and Suit Up. Not terribly surprising. Those are the best commons of each of these colors. If you build your deck with, as many of those cards as possible, it'll do pretty well. The next tier, these are the cards that you like are generally looking to fill your deck with: Searchlight Companion, Experimental Synthesizer, Iron Apprentice, and the Modern Age. Note that Iron Apprentice, the 1/1 artifact creature, or well, the 0/0 artifact creature that comes with a +1/+1 counter that can give to something else when it dies, performs better than every red common creature. And I agree that that matches my experience. I think that it is better than every red common creature. Maybe in general, certainly in this archetype. Having just like 1-cost creatures, if you have any Network Disruptors or Prosperous Thieves, and then to a lesser extent Moon Circuit Hackers is, Moon Snare Specialists is just very, very strong. And it plays well just when you have cheap creatures. It's, pretty easy for it to like trade off and make another creature better, and you're going to have the other creature in play because you have a low curve. You can do tricky stuff with sacrificing it to Voltage Surge as a combat trick to like win a combat somewhere else and stuff. So Iron Apprentice looks comparable to some not very good cards in other formats. Pretty good in this format, and then exceptionally good in blue-red in particular, blue-red and blue-black. I think it's, and really it's just a great red creature. Like I think that it pairs better with the red than with other colors by a noticeable margin. You get the value out of sacrificing it, you get artifact synergies, you get modified synergies. So definitely something that you want to think of largely, but not exclusively, as a red creature, and then prioritize it as the best red common creature. So those are like that list of commons that I've said are, those are commons you should be happy about. There are some other commons that are fine filler playables, Tawashi Songshaper and Unstoppable Ogre and Tamiyo's Completion, cards like that. If your deck doesn't have any of that stuff, you're going to be happier than if it does. Usually it's going to have some of that stuff. Whereas the other cards, like you might, actively be missing any of those that you don't have. Interesting note looking at successful commons. Gift of Wrath, the 4 mana +2/+2 and Menace enchantment, performs appreciably well in this format. Not at the level of the top stuff that I talked about, but like its stats are really comparable with Ironhoof Boar and Skyswimmer Koi, which are kind of just below the like Iron Apprentice Modern Age tier. Notably, Gift of Wrath performs better than like Tamiyo's Completion, which is not a card you should be terribly unhappy to play. Gift of Wrath isn't played a lot. It's a little bit of a risky card. If your opponent Tamiyo's Completions or arrests the thing that you put Gift of Wrath on, it's a pretty big hit. But +2/+2 in Menace, and then also getting another creature after they deal with that, does represent like a very large threat, a lot of damage. It's totally credible to me that this card has pretty good win rate. I think, it's not, again, not something you should prioritize. It's something that you will get for free. And if you're trying to figure out, your like lower tier playables, I would certainly say consider it among your options if it fits well in your curve and strategy. Big picture, I think that this is a deck that plays well at common and at low rarity in general. The more aggressive you are, I've mentioned a lot, the more aggressive you are, the less important it is to have rares because, if your games are ending quickly, there will be a lot of games where you just don't draw them anyway. And I think that this is a deck that's going to succeed or fail more based on how much synergy it has and what its curve is than how strong the best cards in your deck are. This is a nice deck to have in your roster or, deck to know how to draft if you're not getting bombs, but you have some, like you find an open, like any of the many drafts where red is wide open, spot where blue is open, if you can just get, a lot of premium commons, because, sometimes you can position yourself into a spot where color is open, but bombs just happen to not get open and passed to you. Sometimes that's a good space to be in. Sometimes it's a bad space to be in. If you have a control deck that's going to play long games and you're going to need to like stack up the total power level of your deck to the total power of your level of your opponent's deck, even if your colors are open, if the best cards aren't opened, you might end up with a pretty weak deck. Whereas with this deck, if you identify that your lane is open and you're getting all the commons you want, I think you're going to have a pretty good deck regardless of whether the higher rarity cards that you would ideally like to see end up being open and passed to you or not. So a little bit of a safer archetype in that way. Notably, as far as like higher rarity stuff goes, Twin Shot Sniper, the best uncommon in the archetype, is there are only 3 cards in the set perform better than Twin Shot Sniper in blue-red. That's just Fable the Mirror Breaker iteration, the blue equivalent of Fable the Mirror Breaker, the Blue Rare Saga, and then the Blue Dragon, Kairi, or whatever, however that's pronounced, Kairi. Twin Shot Sniper is better than all the other rares, or at least not necessarily quite clearly better than all the other rares. Very similar win rate to a lot of good rares. And it's taken a little bit later. Stats get a little weird comparing there in terms of how much people get attached to their rares or whatever. The point is, there aren't a lot of like super bombs in the archetype or in this format in general. And then like Twin Shot Sniper is quite good, but no, Twin Shot Sniper is quite good. We'll just leave it at that. It's also like there aren't a lot of uncommons either on Twin Shot Sniper's level, and you don't need any of that stuff for the deck to succeed, as I mentioned. Top uncommons in the archetype, I've mentioned some of this. Twin Shot Sniper, I guess I haven't said, the 4 mana 2/3 reach that deals 2 damage to something when it enters the battlefield, and then you can channel it for 2 mana to do 2 damage to something. Patchwork Automaton, that's the 1/1 ward 2 that grows when you play artifacts for 2 mana. Enthusiastic Mechanos, the 2/2 flyer for blue-red. Behold the Unspeakable, that's the 5 mana saga that shrinks your opponent's creatures, draws cards, and becomes a giant flying trampler. Kumano faces Kakazan, that's the saga that does damage to your opponent and then puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you play that turn and then becomes a 2/2 haste that exiles things. Circuit Mender is the artifact 3/2, gain 2 life, when it leaves play, draw a card. Prosperous Thief, the 3/2 ninja, 3 to play, 2 to ninjutsu. When a ninja or rogue hits them, make a treasure. Seismic Wave, that's the 3 mana burn spell that does 2 to any target, 1 to every target except your opponent's artifact creatures. All your opponent's non-artifact creatures and your opponent. Sometimes 3 to, not your opponent. Kills 2 and 3 toughness guys or whatever. High Speed Hover Bike, that's the 2 mana flash vehicle, 2/2 flyer, ETB tap something, crew 1, and Rabbit Battery, the 1/1 haste, reconfigure, give haste. Those are the notably good uncommons. That's the kind of stuff that you're looking for to have a reason to get into this space. Like I said, you don't need a lot of that, but there's still, you probably aren't going to move into drafting red because you saw some network, or blue-red because you saw some network disruptors or whatever. So presumably you'll have a couple of those cards that got you down this path, and then you can kind of just ride your way to a good deck, taking, network disruptors and Kami's Flares and random good cheap blue and red cards from there. Obviously, if it's not clear, you're playing a tempo game, generally aggressive strategy. I'm a big fan of Simian Sling as kind of a way to close out games, push early damage, let your little creatures attack through their slightly less little creatures. You have a lot of good early creatures to push damage in, and then a lot of reasonable ways to stop your opponent from defending themselves. Anything from Network Disruptor, the 1/1 flyer that taps something, to Moonsnare Specialist, the 2/2 ninja that bounces something, to suit up the trick that makes your creature a 4/5 to win combat, to Ironhoof Boar, the 5/4 haste trampler for 6 that you can channel for +3/+1 and trample. Obviously, also every reconfigure creature you can use to make your creatures attack into larger creatures or whatever, not to mention just creatures with flying. So a lot of ways to push damage, make it hard for your opponent to block, get access to finishing your opponent off when they start turning the corner. So strategically, you're trying to play, these 1 and 2 mana creatures that hit for a good amount of damage, punish your opponent for the fact that likely they're, early cards or sagas that don't block well, and then start making tempo plays when your opponent starts, trying to stabilize, and then finish them off with some incidental damage from your Simian Slings or a flyer or burn from your Kami Flares and your Twin Shot Sniper, or, whatever it takes to get the last few points across, get them low, and then play an Ironhoof Boar or channel an Ironhoof Boar. A lot of ways to push the last few points of damage. So that's it. Low curve, aggressive tempo deck. Nothing too fancy. I think it works out reasonably well. I have heard of complaints. I think that, that would likely come from overemphasis on some of the weaker creatures that are less good at pushing damage, more likely to kind of get shut down. I think, your Unstoppable Ogres and Tawashi Song Shapers and stuff have a place in small numbers, but if you try to lean too heavily into an Artifact Matters theme, especially if you start playing Scrapyard Steelbreakers and stuff, I think that your deck gets a little bit clunky, a little bit easy for opposing decks to kind of gum up on the ground. I think you really want to focus on having a nice lean deck with some good tricks and tempo plays to really stop your opponent's larger green creatures from shutting down your aggression. And there you have it. That's my take on blue-red. So I'm going to turn it over to Twitch for questions. So anyone who has any questions about this archetype, whether you've asked them or not, please put them in chat. And while I'm letting people think of those and get them down, anyone who is not already a patron over at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes, encourage you to check out the, site, the benefits, see if you're interested in supporting the program. Also, of course, thank my newest patrons, Cilantro, and Felix. Thank you very much for the support. All right, first question. This might be a tricky question for you to answer, especially considering you draft less red than a lot of other streamers. Okay. But considering there's only really 5 blue commons you want here, can you go into the cost benefit of staying mono red and some medium filler versus red blue for 5-8 blue cards? So while there are like 5 blue cards that are like a step better than the other blue cards, I think it's weird to call out specifically, well, there aren't that many blue cards you really want. Because I would say there are, the only red cards you really want are Flare, Surge, Synthesizer, 3 red cards you really want. I think Song Shaper and Simian Sling are fine if you want to like round it out to 5 of each. Oh, and Boar. But I also don't think that it's, too unreasonable to round blue out and say, well, it's not bad to play a Sky Swimmer Koi or an Armguard Familiar or a Tamiyo's Completion. So I think that, as with really every color in this format, there's kind of like a top some number. I mean, I think that there are pretty appreciable gaps between the top few commons in each color and the next tier and then the next tier, like the premium stuff, the like I'm happy to play this, and then the I guess I can put this in my decks. And I don't think that like blue or red is really all that much deeper than the other color on stuff that you want here. As far as like, well, if there's not that much blue stuff that you want, should I just play more of the red cards? That's kind of what I was talking about at the end in terms of like, I think that this deck's biggest fail state is when you have just like too many of those like red ground-based creatures. I think that the blue like evasion and tempo elements are really important for the deck in terms of just like not having your red creatures ultimately get embarrassed by like getting shut down by Imperial Oath, and then before that, like your opponent's Kami of Terrible Secrets or Jukai Preservers or whatever. I think that there are just like a lot of creatures that are just like a little bit bigger than the red creatures in a way where if you're like really relying on red creatures, it can cause some vulnerabilities. My blue-red decks have generally erred toward more blue than red. That's, I think that if you happen to get like a lot of synthesizers and surges, like, if red's wide open, it's not like a problem if you end up being more red than blue, if that's where the good cards are. But I do think that, as far as like, looking at all of the commons that exist, are there like a lot more red commons than you want than blue? I don't think so. I think that the two colors are actually pretty balanced in terms of like how many cards, like is a given pack more likely to have a good red card for you or a good blue card for you or whatever. Next up, is Tawashi Guidebot good in this deck? I didn't mention it, and no. So I love Tawashi Guidebot, but the reason that I love Tawashi Guidebot is that I expect my games to be longer than most players. And Tawashi Guidebot is a card that's quality is just directly related to the number of turns that you think a game is going to be. If you're hanging out for a long time and you can spend mana drawing cards with it, Tawashi Guidebot, incidentally, is the 4 mana 2/1 ETB, put a +1/+1 counter on something, and then 4 minus number of modified creatures, tap, draw a card. That card is good if you are likely to get into like board stalls where you can like draw cards and win the board stall because you drew cards. Blue-red is like generally trying to end the game rather than trying to hang out. The extra cards that you draw are more likely to be low impact and not matter even if you can get into the state where you're using the guide bot. And then I also mentioned that the deck in general just like naturally has other mana sinks, such that a card that lets you spend 4 mana to draw a card, likely in the late game that would be the best thing that you can spend mana on, but not necessarily worth going out of your way to have a thing to spend mana on when you already have, your experimental synthesizers and reconfigures and replaying the guys that you've picked up with ninjutsu and stuff like that. So I do think that this is one of the worst archetypes for Tawashi Guidebot, which is a card that I think generally works pretty well in my decks, so I take it pretty highly, but it's a card with kind of mediocre stats across the board, and this is the kind of deck that would pull its stats down. Next up, would you splash Oni Cult Anvil if you had a few dual lands? Oni Cult Anvil is, I believe, the second best non-rare card to splash in the archetype after Imperial Oath. I think that it is reasonable to splash. It would depend a little bit on how good my deck is at using it. Most red decks use it very well. It would depend a little bit on, how much like filtering type stuff I have. Like the more I have like Modern Age and Moon Circuit Hacker or whatever to help find the mana for it, or like discard it if I just don't think it's going to work out or whatever. But I do think that Oni Cult Anvil is a splashable card under the right circumstances. Next up, there are a lot of artifacts and artifact payoffs in red and blue. There are also some guard artifacts in black. Can the blue-red deck benefit from specific black artifacts, and how does the mana fixing into Grixis factor into a Grixis artifact deck? So I've been asked about Grixis artifacts a few times recently. I have never drafted a Grixis artifact deck. I mentioned that with blue red, I don't think that you want to try to push the like artifact matters stuff too far. I think you can, take advantage of a few incidental synergies because a lot of the cards that you want happen to be artifacts. But outside of Patchwork Automaton, I don't think that you're getting paid very much for artifact synergies in these colors. And I also think that if you have Automaton, you can kind of naturally find enough artifacts that you don't really need to go to black just to like get more artifacts. And I think that the decks in this space, like any two of the Grixis pair, like color pairs, I think generally want to be aggressive, and the more aggressive you are, the worse splashing is. So I think that even though all of these pairs do theoretically have overlap in the artifact space, I think it's rare that you want to bother to play all of them rather than just choosing a pair. There just aren't that many cards that like reward you for kind of like discovered synergies in the 3-color deck, I think. And then I also I mentioned that this deck is kind of very good at like spending all of its mana because of how much you want like 1-drops and reconfigure and ninjutsu and stuff. All of that means that tapped lands are more likely to relevantly like to cost a mana on any turn that you draw them, because you're spending a lot of mana and you're capable of spending it in small increments. So it's just less likely that you have like an unused mana some turn to play a tapped land without a drawback, which is another reason not to prioritize taking those lands in the draft, which means that you're going to be less well positioned to pivot or to splash. And then also just like not wanting to take a card that would ask you to take those lands because you still will have the same incentives not to take or play those lands. So at least for me, I have not been in a draft yet where it made sense to like try to go into that space. Given the recommendation of playing a low curve and reconfigure a ninjutsu or ways to spend mana, does that mean instants like Thirst for Knowledge or Disruption Protocol are less desirable despite fitting the artifact synergies? Yes, I do believe that. I think there is an archetype that uses Thirst for Knowledge, Disruption Protocol, and the 2-mana artifact that draws 2, and then red removal. Like that would be the other space that I talked about that's playing more of the really wants just like red removal and then likely wants to splash Imperial Oath. And I've also had like a blue-black version of that deck that had Disruption Protocol plus a bunch of card draw and positioned itself into a controlling space. I think the tools are there to do that, but it's very different than the like red-minded blue-red deck. So there is hypothetically that control space, and I do think that Thirst for Knowledge and Disruption Protocol play well together. But I think that the like aggressive space that I think plays to this deck's strengths a little more naturally doesn't want those cards. And when I say plays to this archetype strengths more naturally, I'm talking about like, in addition to the fact that red just like is red, generally likes to be aggressive, the top blue commons in terms of like how kind of like strong they are based on how much they win in general, being Network Disruptor, Modern Age, Moonsnare Specialist, Moon Circuit Hacker, Suit Up, like all of when all the blue cards are aggressive, and then you pair red like blue with red, which generally lends to being aggressive, it's hard to go like, oh well, I have these two colors that both really like to attack, and have good synergies when I put them together and try to attack with them. So I guess I'm just going to draft a bunch of card draw and removal and counter spells. Like, you can do it. I think it's more likely that you end up in that space if you end up with like some, strong blue and red rares, and then maybe someone else is kind of taking the aggressive cards, or maybe they're taking like one of the colors of aggressive cards. Like maybe there's a blue-black ninja player in front of you. And so they're taking your network disruptors and your moon snare specialists, but they're giving you those counter spells and card draw spells, and then maybe red's open, so you're getting the red removal. I could see it happening. I don't think it's the default way to draft blue and red, but I do think that there is, that deck that really wants Imperial Oath as its like top end that leans into all of that card draw counterspell removal space. Next up, how many cards like Boar are you willing to play to end games, and about how many 2-drops do you want? I know you mentioned low curve, but is there a number of finishers you like to have versus early 1 and 2-drops? So the thing about Boar is that it doubles as, +2/+1 and trample, or +3/+1 and trample for 2 mana. So in a pinch, you can get away with playing more of them and just being like, yeah, whatever, this is an aggressive trick. That said, I'd be pretty unhappy to play more than 2 Boars and generally think I just want 1, barring special circumstances. And then as far as like 2-drops, it's tricky because they're like, often when you say like how many 2-drops do you want, what you really are talking about is like, assuming that you have like very few 1-drops, like the 2-drops at the beginning of your game. Like maybe you're going like tap land into 2-drop or just nothing into 2-drop. And in this deck, it's like, I'm hoping to have like 5 to 8 1-drops. And then on top of that, I would like 5 to 10 more 2-mana plays. If I give you a number that's just like a very large number for how many 2-drops I want, my concern would be, but like, do you have enough 1-drops also? And then, if I were to say, well, like, okay, well, what's the greatest number of like 4 and 5-drops you want? Or 3 and 4-drops you want? It's like, well, kind of depends on like how on plan they are. And I had a deck the other day with 6 Moonsnare specialists. Would I tell you to play 6 4-drops? No. Is Moonsnare specialist a 4-drop? No, not exactly, especially if you have a lot of 1 and 2-drops. You could play it for 3 mana. There's, some weirdness there, but like, and I don't want to just be like, oh, no, just play every 2-drop you possibly can, because I think if you fill your deck with Armguard Familiars and Twashi Song Shapers and Patchwork Decoys, or whatever the 2/1 that you can spend 2 mana and draw a card when it leaves play. If you have a bunch of that stuff in your blue-red deck, I think your blue-red deck's really bad, because those cards can kind of get like shut down pretty easily, and you need a bunch of support to like make sure that you can attack with them. I think that the guideline, try to keep your curve low and try to like have a good like, disruptive tempo plan where you make sure that like you have like evasion and removal and ways to get through your opponent's blocker, is like a better way to think of it than like, okay, exactly what do I want my curve to be? Cool. I'm going to wrap it up there. We have, I think, 3 more archetypes to cover. So kind of wrapping things up, or, getting into the home stretch on Neon Dynasty. I believe that we'll be finishing this. I should really think through exact dates and stuff. I believe that we'll be finishing this before we're ready for Nuke Penna. I know there's going to be Cube up, Tinker's Cube up on Arena for a little while in there, Dominaria for a little while in there. So I need to look into the timing as we wrap up Neon Dynasty, figuring out if there's going to be, a weird episode in there somewhere. But for now, we're going to stick to finishing out these last archetypes. Should have time to cover everything. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.